So you worked in sustainability as well as supply chain. Mm, when I was taking classes in graduate school, we wrote a lot. So I thought sustainability is about reporting. How is it related to supply chain?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And to be fair, reporting was the big topic of the day when we were in school, right? But if you think about, let's just talk about operations in general, right? From manufacturing all the way to supply chain. If you are making something, if you think about the machines, maybe there's a furnace that is being used and you're putting all these raw materials. Let's just take like a specific example, like a car seat, right? So say you are making a car seat, there's many materials that go into that, and there's a lot of fuel that needs to be used to make that car seat, right? So that's the manufacturing piece of it. And then there's also the moving of the material. So there's making and then there's moving. So you're moving things from place to place, maybe from your factory to your distribution center to your end customer, right? And when you're moving things, you could use trucks, ships, cars, trains, and all of those have fuel usage related to those as well, right? And so there's emissions along every step of the value chain, including when you're buying things from other people. Say like you don't want to buy the plastic that comes on like a certain side of that car seat. Someone else was making that, someone else was moving that, right? And so when it comes to taking a full like a bird's eye view of everything, it's someone needs to account for, okay, every time I move this or make this, like, what is the emissions that's associated with that? And so it's actually a very deeply operational question um, that requires a lot of math and a lot of counting.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Signals. I'm your host, Gwen Chen. Joining me today is Theo Tran. Theo has spent her career helping organizations navigate sustainability transformation. Today, we will talk about how sustainability is moving from reporting to business value and how AI is reshaping the future of operations. Theo, welcome to Signals.
Gwen, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So, Theo, talk about the sustainable operations at BCG, what it means, and what is the problem you guys are helping customers solve?
Yeah, sure. So I will say the portfolio that I manage is one of many sustainability topics that BCG covers. So what we're focused, or what my team is focused on specifically, is the intersection of sustainability and operations, right? So that means if you think about things like procurement, supply chain, manufacturing, and how do you take the business approach while adding a sustainability lens on top of that. And so, it's, I would say, like two groups within an organization that haven't always historically talked to each other, but there can be a lot of synergies when the incentives are put in the right places, right? To both become more efficient, to reduce costs, but also to make things more sustainable. And so that's what our team does, is we help clients look at specific challenges that they're having in the operations space, and also help them identify areas where they can reduce their emissions and reach their net zero targets.
So you started your career, sustainability career at Scott Maiden, and now you lead global offers at BCG. Sustainability have changed a lot over the past decade or so. What is the biggest shift you've seen?
Goodness, there have been many. But I will say, when I was first starting out in the industry, there was a lot of momentum around the topic, right? And a lot of companies were signing up for decarbonization targets. And I think there was also a lot of emphasis on compliance and standards, right? It kind of felt a little bit like an alphabet soup of what do I need to keep up with? There's GRI, there's SASB, there's TCFD, there's SBTI, right? There was a lot of noise in the market. And I think what we're seeing now is now that companies are actually trying to figure out what it means to
decarbonize, it's hard, right? And so I think there's more of a focus now, not so much on the reporting and compliance piece, but really on how do we incorporate this into our operations, and progress actual change with this. Interestingly enough, though, I think everything's cyclical, and I do see the conversation shift a bit more towards standards and reporting now, mostly because there have been a lot of changes in the standards, right? So you have SBTI, the Science Based Target Initiative. They just released their version 2.0 of their guidance. There's some changes happening on the greenhouse gas inventory front as well. So it's the conversation around guidance and compliance has come up again, and it does vary across different markets too. But I will say the thing that has been encouraging to see is the real emphasis on operationalizing decarbonization initiatives.
Yeah. It's similar in marketing and similar in my trade as well. Like when you advise something to clients, if everything, stay with reporting, it won't really drive changes. So in sustainability as well as ops, a lot of companies, they publish reports, sustainability reports, right?
Yeah.
And in your opinion or in your experience, how many of them are actually like changing how they operate?
This is a very challenging question. I will say not enough, right? But I think there's a real burden that comes with reporting, and it's important because you can't change what you don't have information on. And so, there is value to getting a handle on your emissions baseline, on understanding like where your hotspots are. But, we've actually done a survey in 2025 in partnership with CO2 AI. It's our annual climate emission survey. And we surveyed about, let's call it 2,000 executives globally on their sustainability initiatives. And what we found was only 7% of these large companies even comprehensively reported emissions across scope 1, 2, and 3. But the interesting thing is that they're also maintaining or increasing the sustainability investments that they're making. There was about 70% of those companies that we surveyed were maintaining or increasing investments. So I think the question is really, how do we kind of shift? How do we make the reporting burden easier while also putting our efforts towards initiatives that are going to move the needle, right? And so, yeah, I think it's a tough task that sustainability teams have to do the reporting and to initiate these changes with their stakeholders.
Yeah, but it's good to see that more and more companies are increasing their investment, right? Increasing investment means more changes. So today, where do you think companies are still like inefficient when it comes to sustainable operations?
Yeah, I think a lot of our clients struggle with sustainable supply chain and procurement. So if you kind of think of it in two buckets, there's scope 1 and 2, which is really emissions that come from your own operations, right? And then there's scope 3, which is emissions that comes from how you buy things. So, the procurement of things. And I would say if you really kind of dig a bit deeper, that means if you're a company, you could be buying through hundreds of thousands of suppliers, right? And not all of your suppliers are equipped or have the data readily available for you to understand like what the sources of emissions are. And so I think the challenge there really is that it's an effort and data issue, right? And so you don't have the data and it takes so much time to even comb through what you have. And I think that's where there is real room to increase efficiencies, especially, this may be a hot take, but especially with the proliferation of AI as well, to be able to reduce some of those manual tasks, right? Or to be able to automate things and scale a bit quicker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked about inefficiency. And then what about the budget in a very tight budget environment? Where do you see or how do leaders justify their investment in sustainability?
Yeah, so I would say, the good thing about a tighter budget environment, right, is it really encourages folks to focus on the things that are truly moving the needle. And so I would say it's not about kind of doing things because they're right, which you should do, right? But it's also providing like a quantitative value on sustainability investments. And so it could be, I would say, translating the benefits into commercial terms that the rest of the business will understand. So for example, how can you talk to your finance team or your other stakeholders about the fact that if you implement XYZ initiatives, you can actually have a quick payback period and you may be able to fund the rest of the journey to decarbonize to net zero, right? Or another thing that we've seen too is if there's a cost out initiative in procurement programs, 30 to 60% of those levers could move the needle either way. They could increase emissions or they could reduce emissions, right? And so if you're talking in the language of the other business stakeholders, it's easier to kind of tie performance to the metrics that they're being measured against, right? Because there's so many teams, everybody's pressed for budget, for resources, for time. And so how do you make sure that the incentives are aligned in a way that drives everyone forward towards the same goal?
Yeah, every orgs have different metrics, have different priorities, and why would they want to support your work, right? Without, aligning or talking through their language, the language they can understand.
Help them essentially convince their stakeholders and organizations to get on board too, right? There's a lot of change management that happens with these types of things.
Yeah, you must have seen and done a lot in the consulting industry. I will come back later on this. So you've been in the industry for many years. Based on your experience, what separates organizations that successfully transform from those that struggle?
Yeah. I would say definitely a key thing is kind of senior stakeholder alignment before initiatives occur, right? Because I think when there's support from the top, it's much easier to push any type of change through. It doesn't have to be sustainability specifically, but having that alignment, ideally at the board level, the C-suite level, is going to make the path a lot easier, right? And then also having very clear like metrics, KPIs. And again, KPIs that actually mean something beyond just the sustainability team. Of course, reaching targets or progress towards targets is important, but like we just spoke about earlier, what are some of these other metrics that will resonate with some of the stakeholders across the organization, right? So it could be, percentage of suppliers that meet the criteria to help decarbonize, or what percentage of raw materials are we getting that is emission intensive? Translating things into, I would say, targets that have a little bit more range.
Yeah. So when you talk to senior executives, like what are the things they care most when you try to convince them to pay more attention to sustainability?
It depends on which executive we're talking to, right? But if I take the lens from a sustainable operations perspective, I think what's really resonating right now is that it's not so much the message around, are we on track to meet net zero? Because that's a very complicated question to try to answer. But how are we future proofing our business? How are we making our supply chains more resilient? How can we ensure that we're not interrupting operations or service levels, right? Because, for example, maybe we didn't realize when we were building out our distribution network that one of them is in a very climate stressed area, or there's a high risk of climate related events that are happening, right? So, for example, I think one of our clients engaged us because in their distribution network, one of their distribution centers was hit by a hurricane and it completely knocked out their operations, right? And so it's where are the failure points that we need to address to make sure that we're more resilient for the future? And how can we think about building things in a way that make it more resilient, better for the environment, better for people, right? That's kind of I think the framing that is really resonating right now.
Let's be specific in terms of the executive audience, right? If you're advising a CEO today, what would be the top priorities, top sustainability priorities for the next 3 years?
Yes. Well, I think there's a lot that's changing right now. There's also the new SBTI guidance standards that have just come out, right? So I would say if we're kind of looking at the immediate future, I would focus on ensuring that they have a good grasp of where their emission intensive activities are, right? So if you are, for example, like a consumer goods product company and you're making yogurt, there are many types of emissions and raw materials that are baked into that, right? So is that company equipped to be able to answer what percentage of my products are coming from steel, from plastics, from chemicals, right? Because that's going to be something that companies who want to continue on the path will need to get a very good inventory on in order to meet like these new standards going forward. So that would be one. I think the other two would be also just upskilling their employees on what it means to have sustainability baked in, right? Because if you're talking to an operations person, they might understand things very specific to, say, a plant or the supply chain, but they may not understand the implications of some of these decisions on emissions, right? So it's making that connection for them so that you have multiple champions within the company versus a small but mighty sustainability team, right?
Yeah, that's a good practice. I've seen that in my previous companies as well. We had a central sustainability office, but then we also have advocates and champions on different orgs, including marketing orgs, actually.
Yeah, a lot of sense. I mean, I think the interesting thing about sustainability, like we think of it as kind of an overlay, right? So it touches many different functions, it touches many different industries, and the answer is going to be different depending on what intersection of those two you're at. And so there's not a single person that can understand everything that's going on in the business, right? So that's why you need the champions within the business units to help drive the change forward.
So earlier in the conversation, you mentioned about executives should focus on what's really moving the needle, what's driving the biggest change. So what is one area on the ops side companies are still underestimating today that could actually make a huge impact on sustainability?
Yeah, I would say like it's not going to be the flashiest answer, right? But we've actually done a study with WEF as well on just kind of some of the upcoming technologies that may be of interest, and it's frontier technologies in operations. Predictive maintenance is up there, and if you think about it, it makes sense because if you already have an asset that's deployed, the most sustainable thing to do is to keep it running as efficiently and for as long as possible, right? Instead of building an entirely new asset to replace what you have. And if you are able to predict when you need to maintain that asset, you can reduce the energy efficiency, you can reduce the amount of time that you have to take the asset offline, you can reduce waste. So there's a lot baked in there. I think it's, again, maybe not the flashiest tech, but there's something there that I think folks should keep an eye out for.
Yeah. I feel like I hear more and more in recent years. I mean, 10 years ago when we were in school, in traditional machine learning, predictive maintenance was a term in car makers and even elevators. But now I'm hearing more and more predictive maintenance. Maybe Gen AI is making predictive maintenance more practical and easier. So what you're talking about, like maintaining the machines as opposed to producing something new, does that also apply to like clothing? Like, for example, a lot of people are not buying new clothing. They're renting clothes from other places. Is that a good practice for sustainability as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm not going to get the statistic right, but there's a colleague of mine who works in the cotton industry out here in North Carolina, and he was stating that, and someone will need to fact check me on this, but something like 60% of the clothing that's manufactured never even gets into the hands of customers. It just goes to landfill. And so the idea that we shouldn't be making more, right? It should be extending the life of what we have. And I think there are some initiatives that we're working on with coalitions as well on how do we get that value back from textiles. And it's the principle of the circular economy, right? And I think up until recently, that's been a really challenging question to get the answer to, because if you think about the fabrics that we have today, it's not 100% cotton, right? It's a blend of different materials. And so the thing about getting that value back is you need to extract those materials into separate things again, right? So if you have a cloth that is woven with 5 different types of materials, how are you going to get 5 different types of materials back out? And some of the innovation that we've seen in this space, I think, uses chemical technology to be able to separate those out again. And so, I'm seeing movement in the industry that's looking at ways to retain that value or to get that value back. into the supply chain and out of the landfill.
Wow. Wow. 60%, that's a huge number.
Not that one though, please. But it was a rather large number. I think they were even saying that you could see from outer space, like the size of the clothing landfill. We'll link to this information after the.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to ask a question about AI. AI drives a lot of demand for energy and infrastructure, a lot of resources as well. Is AI helping sustainability or is it making the problem harder?
Honestly, I think the answer is both. It's no surprise, and I think I've quite talked about the subject that there's a lot of energy demand, as you said, right, related to AI usage. But it's also allowing companies and people to be more efficient in certain things, right? So predictive maintenance that we talked about earlier, or being able to synthesize a lot of data. Like we talked about earlier too, the burden of reporting, right? I think that if deployed in the right way, this will actually be able to help free up a lot of the time of the sustainability teams to move from the reporting burden and into the actual action around decarbonization, right? So it is both. And I think it's a tricky balance right now that everyone is still trying to understand the exact impact of and figure out the best way to approach it.
Yeah. So you sort of touched on my next question on the practical AI use cases in sustainability. Is automating reporting one of the popular use cases?
Yeah, automating reporting. I would say also being able to use it to synthesize data out in the field. So, for example, I am not the expert in this topic, but what we've seen, and there's a report that we should link to after that. We'll go into this in better detail, but we've seen that companies that have utilized AI see a much greater return and progress on their sustainability initiatives. And that report lists out the different use cases there, but reporting is certainly one of them. I think there's more around like data collection and gathering as well. So like the predictive maintenance as an example. Yeah, there's a lot more and like some very niche applications too that you wouldn't have thought of.
Okay, let's switch gears to leadership and career. I'm really curious to know like about your trade in consulting and sustainability, the combination of it. So consulting apparently require a lot of influencing without direct authority, right? Because you are not part of the client team. And what is your approach of driving changes at the client side?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's a few different keys to success in influencing change. One is to have the facts, right? And so a lot of times if you're coming with a request, it's framing it in a way that answers questions that matter to your stakeholder. So it could be it may not be obvious questions too. It could be, for example, like how much time is this going to save me personally, or how is this going to help me meet my KPIs, right? I think it's about understanding the incentives of the person that you're trying to work with and helping them achieve those incentives in a way that's synergistic with the initiative that you're trying to push, ideally, right? So if you're trying to, I would say, change someone's mind who doesn't want to be changed, I think there's other things as well in terms of, again, understanding like who has the influence in the room and being able to get folks aligned on a common path forward. Unfortunately, I can't give you like a blanket here's the answer because it varies a lot depending on the stakeholders, but incentives matter. Make sure to have the facts and frame things with your audience in mind.
Yeah. What stakeholder group is hardest to convince?
I will say, and I'm not going to boil it down to a single group, right? But I will say across the board, it's the stakeholder whose incentives are not aligned with your own. Because again, if we're just thinking about teams as a whole, right? Limited resources, limited budget, limited time in the day. And so if you're not talking in the same language that they are, or not framing things against what they are measured against, then that's going to be the hardest stakeholder to convince, especially if they don't already initially believe in what you're trying to convince them on, right? That's the toughest. And that can apply to any type of question, initiative, or anything like that.
I'm thinking about another possible use case for AI in the sustainability area. Are you guys using more and more AI in researching before client meetings, in a context of convincing stakeholders to adopt something new?
I mean, I certainly believe we do use it as a tool, right? But not as the only thing that we do, because again, there are certain things that AI can't replace, like human judgment. I think AI has made a lot of progress in the past year and 2 years, right? But there's still, I would say, opportunities where it does hallucinate or it does things that you don't quite expect. And so we're not at a point right now in time where we can just take things at face value. And so I think it's, again, very helpful as a starting point for teams to do research, but there are some caveats to it as well, right? And so that's why I think we hear a lot about having a human in the loop when we're designing AI solutions. It's the important step to ensure that what we are researching is true and accurate and helpful for our clients.
Okay, 3 more questions. Looking ahead 5 years, or if you think it's too long, maybe 2 years, where will sustainable operations look like? That would surprise people today.
Okay, let's revisit this question in 2 years and see how great my predictions are. But I think in 2 years, AI will cut the cost of emissions management or measurement drastically, right? Because a lot of emissions management or measurement has to do with collecting data from many different sources in different formats. I think AI is a great tool to use in that situation. And so I'm hoping that will be the case where it reduces the time and money spent on data collection. And then maybe in a longer time frame, like let's call it 5 to 10 years from now. This is a double-edged sword because I work in sustainability, but I actually hope it does become unremarkable. Like it just becomes embedded into all of our daily operations, right? It's just another metric on, like you said, in marketing, in operations, and all of this. And it's just second nature.
It's similar to AI, right? We talk about AI is immersed everywhere. Maybe sustainability in the ideal world should be everywhere without people even noticing. That would be perfect.
Let's come back to this in 2, 5, and 10 years and see.
Yeah, I would love to invite you again, Theo, to revisit this topic. Okay, so for young professionals, what advice would you give to them who want to build careers at the intersection of sustainability and ops and AI?
Yeah, it's funny. If you had asked me this when we were first starting out in the industry, right, I think my answer would have been so different. But and it would have been like get very fluent in sustainability. But now it's almost the opposite, where I'd say you need to have operational credibility first, right? So I think historically there's been folks who are really deeply entrenched and knowledgeable about sustainability standards and whatnot. But in order to enact change, they would have to talk to the operations department, to the finance department. And if you're not fluent or credible in those areas, then you're not going to affect change. So I would actually say if operations is the place that you want to go, or finance or marketing, like get fluent in those topics first and then layer on sustainability. Because that's how I think you're going to be able to drive the most change.
Yeah. So would you say key stakeholders of sustainability include supply chain / ops, and then finance, and then maybe marketing?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, marketing has, especially if you're doing reporting of any sort, right? Presumably marketing will have some hand in that or be able to help contribute to that. Yeah. So I would say, I mean, ideally it gets embedded everywhere, right? But the heavy hitters are certainly finance and operations.
Finance and operations.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And what are you currently reading or watching or listening?
This may be so maybe not what you expect, but I have 2 young kids, and so right now I'm spending a lot of my time reading children's books, but nothing for myself. And my kids and I have been fun kind of revisiting books from my childhood, and then if they have movies attached to them, watching those related movies. So we just got through with Matilda by Roald Dahl. It's so fun, like watching these movies with very little special effects back in the day, right? And yet my kids still love it. So that's been kind of a fun side thing that we've been doing.
Yeah. My daughter also loved Matilda. She watched many times.
Yeah,
Maybe
I was talking about having magical powers, right? I think like who doesn't want magical powers?
exactly. If I were to ask, hey Gwen, if you can have one magical power, what would it be? I would say make an impact on sustainability and so that we can have a greener planet.
I love that. And let's have multiple people with that magical power.
And thank you so much for joining us and really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been so fun, and we'll do a reunion episode.
See you later.